Hey everyone, we are back. I hope you all had a good rest day. You were able to catch up on some readings or just spend some time with God. Look, today we have a very long psalm. It's going to take up the majority of time. I just have a few lessons and a revelation about this one. So we're going to go ahead and get straight into it. Make sure you're liking, commenting, share the video, and subscribe to my channel. Let's go. Alright guys, you ready? I am reading from the NIV. My people, hear my teaching. Listen to the words of my mouth. I will open my mouth with a parable. I will utter hidden things, things from of old, things we have heard and known, things our ancestors have told us. We will not hide them from their descendants. We will tell the next generation the praiseworthy deeds of the Lord, his power, and the wonders he has done. He decreed statutes for Jacob and established the law in Israel, which he commanded our ancestors to teach their children, so the next generation would know them, even the children yet to be born, and they in turn would tell their children. Then they would put their trust in God and would not forget his deeds, but would keep his commands. They would not be like their ancestors, a stubborn and rebellious generation, whose hearts were not loyal to God, whose spirits were not faithful to him. The men of Ephraim, though armed with bows, turned back on the day of battle. They did not keep God's covenant and refused to live by his law. They forgot what he had done, the wonders he had shown. He did miracles in the sight of their ancestors in the land of Egypt, in the region of Zoan. He divided the sea and led them through. He made the water stand up like a wall. He guided them with the cloud by day and with light from the fire all night. He split the rocks in the wilderness and gave them water as abundant as the seas. He brought streams out of a rocky crag and made water flow down like rivers. But they continued to sin against him, rebelling in the wilderness against the Most High. They willfully put God to the test by demanding the food they craved. They spoke against God. They said, "Can God really spread a table in the wilderness?" True, he struck the rock and water gushed out. Streams flowed abundantly, but can he also give us bread? Can he supply meat for his people? When the Lord heard them, he was furious. His fire broke out against Jacob, and his wrath rose against Israel, for they did not believe in God or trust in his deliverance. Yet he gave a command to the skies and opened the doors of the heavens. He rained down manna for the people to eat. He gave them the grain of heaven. Human beings ate the bread of angels. He sent them all the food they could eat. He let loose the east wind from the heavens, and by his power made the south wind blow. He rained meat down on them like dust, birds like sand on the seashore. He made them come down inside their camp, all around their tents. They ate till they were gorged. He had given them what they craved. But before they turned from what they craved, even while the food was still in their mouths, God's anger rose against them. He put to death the sturdiest among them, cutting down the young men of Israel. In spite of all this, they kept on sinning. In spite of his wonders, they did not believe. So he ended their days in futility and their years in terror. Whenever God slew them, they would seek him. They eagerly turned to him again. They remembered that God was their rock, that God Most High was their Redeemer. But then they would flatter him with their mouths, lying to him with their tongues. Their hearts were not loyal to him. They were not faithful to his covenant. Yet he was merciful. He forgave their iniquities and did not destroy them. Time after time he restrained his anger and did not stir up his full wrath. He remembered that they were but flesh, a passing breeze that does not return. How often they rebelled against him in the wilderness and grieved him in the wasteland. Again and again they put God to the test. They vexed the Holy One of Israel. They did not remember his power, the day he redeemed them from the oppressor, the day he displayed his signs in Egypt, his wonders in the region of Zoan. He turned their river into blood. They could not drink from their streams. He sent swarms of flies that devoured them and frogs that devastated them. He gave their crops to the grasshopper, their produce to the locust. He destroyed their vines with hail and their sycamore figs with sleet. He gave over their cattle to the hail, their livestock to bolts of lightning. He unleashed against him his hot anger, his wrath, indignation, and hostility, a band of destroying angels. He prepared a path for his anger. He did not spare them from death, but gave them over to the plague. He struck down all the firstborn of Egypt, the first fruits of manhood in the tents of Ham. But he brought his people out like a flock. He led them like sheep through the wilderness. He guided them safely, so they were unafraid. But the sea engulfed their enemies. And so he brought them to the border of his holy land, to the hill country his right hand had taken. He drove out nations before them and allotted their lands to them as an inheritance. He settled the tribes of Israel in their homes. But they put God to the test and rebelled against the Most High. They did not keep his statutes. Like their ancestors, they were disloyal and faithless, as unreliable as a faulty bow. They angered him with their high places. They aroused his jealousy with their idols. When God heard them, he was furious. He rejected Israel completely. He abandoned the tabernacle of Shiloh, the tent he had set up among humans. He sent the ark of his mighty into captivity, his splendor into the hands of the enemy. He gave his people over to the sword. He was furious with his inheritance. Fire consumed their young men, and their young women had no wedding songs. Their priests were put to the sword, and their widows could not weep. Then the Lord awoke as from a sleep, as a warrior wakes from the stupor of wine. He beat back his enemies. He put them to everlasting shame. Then he rejected the tents of Joseph. He did not choose the tribe of Ephraim, but he did choose the tribe of Judah, Mount Zion, which he loved. He built his sanctuary like the heights, like the earth that he established forever. He chose David as his servant and took him from the sheep pens. From tending the sheep, he brought him to be the shepherd of his people Jacob, of Israel, his inheritance. And David shepherded them with integrity of heart. With skillful hands, he led them. All right, so this is both a historical and a psalm of wisdom. We have here both a historical account and a lesson, a teaching. So starting out in verse 4, we have a declaration that they aren't going to hide from their past. They want their children to know both the good and the bad. And as verses 5 through 8 says, this teaches them not only about God's sovereignty and love, but it shows how disobedience and stubbornness can lead to destruction. So it's basically a warning to not let history repeat itself. So what we have here in the majority of the psalm is a detailed overview of what happened in the Exodus, the plagues in Egypt, the parting of the Red Sea, the occurrences in the wilderness, both the miracles and the disobedience. And then we end at David becoming king. So some of the things we see in here that are kind of a warning, or that they're warning against, are backsliding, being demanding or over particular, disobedience, ungratefulness, testing God, repeated and unrepented sin, and then arrogance. So I'm going to go a little bit deeper into that for my revelation, and I'm going to go to verses 32 through 38. It says, "In spite of all this, they kept on sinning. In spite of his wonders, they did not believe. So he ended their days in futility and their years in terror. Whenever God slew them, they would seek him. They eagerly turned to him again. They remembered that God was their rock, that God Most High was their Redeemer. But then they would flatter him with their mouths, lying to him with their tongues. Their hearts were not loyal to him. They were not faithful to his covenant. Yet he was merciful. He forgave their iniquities and did not destroy them. Time after time, he restrained his anger and did not stir up his full wrath." So there is a pattern here. God gives, people take it for granted. God forgives, or God disciplines, and the people turn back to him for a while. Then God gives again because he's a forgiving God. And then the people go back to doing what they were doing before. So it's this cycle. God rebukes to get people on track. They're good for a while. They turn back to God. And then after when the status quo keeps going, then they turn away from God and they start doing, they start sinning again. And in all of this, God's love and mercy still reign true, that his love still won out over his anger. But really, when I looked at this psalm, I thought, wow, what a lesson for us during this time, during this quarantine, during this new experience that we're all having. And I thought, what is going to happen when everything goes back to normal? I know we're going to have a new normal, but what's going to happen when we can finally get back to what we are used to doing again? I think of, when quarantines end and when we're allowed to go back out again, we'll be all excited. When we get to go to church again, we're going to hug and love and we're going to praise God and we're going to dance and we're going to have this overwhelming joy. But what happens after a month? What happens after 3 months? What happens after a year? Do we go back into the status quo, into the old way of doing things? Do we sink into this comfortable place with God where we're just going back to what we were doing, and we might turn back again to our destructive ways after we settle in again? Will we have this lukewarm loyalty to God after this thing settles down for a while? I don't like to think, or I don't like to talk a lot about this, but we are called to make changes as God does stuff in the earth. And if we kind of go back to this lukewarmness, especially of American Christianity, what will God have to do next to get us to turn back to him, to get us so our hearts are loyal to him, that our hearts and minds are stayed on him? Will we fall into this cycle? Will we fall back into the cycle of God giving, us receiving with joy, but then turning to old ways, and then God rebuking, and then going over and over and over again? And I just encourage you, as I'm trying to do myself, is just prepare for what will happen down the road. Really prepare our hearts. Get to really know God during this time, so when it does go back to normal, we are changed and we remain changed. We don't fall back to what we used to know. So that's just something to think about. We never want to test God's mercy. We don't want to test God's grace. We want to be willing and grateful recipients of his love, and we have to just remain turned towards him at all times. All right, guys, share with me what you thought about this psalm. It's long. It's a little different from what we have seen so far, so I want to hear from you. I want to know what you thought about this. And maybe you got a different revelation out of this. Maybe you saw this paralleling our time right now in a different way. Just let me know. Share in the comments, and we'll have a discussion about it. All right, so I will see you tomorrow again. Have a good rest of your day. Bye.